want to talk to you today about one of the basic arguments. In fact, for a while I thought it was the basic argument for skepticism. It's called the argument from variability. Gisela Stryker has explained its importance for the history of skepticism and has outlined in detail the structure of this kind of argument. I want to talk about that structure. I want to see how it's manifested in various authors in various ways, and try to understand what is it that is motivating skeptics throughout the ages. As we'll see, it's a very powerful argument from the point of view of ancient skeptics. It's revived in the medieval and early modern period, and then in contemporary philosophy it becomes known as the argument from disagreement. But it's essentially the same argument. So let's see what the structure of it is. Here is my favorite statement of this argument. It's really an example, but it's a marvelous example. This comes from the ancient Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi, somebody who writes in the Taoist tradition and gives a number of marvelous skeptical arguments and wonderful illustrations. Zhuangzi is one of the few philosophers who are really fun to read. "A keeper of monkeys," replied Zichi, "said with regard to the rations of chestnuts that each monkey was to have 3 in the morning and 4 at night. But at this the monkeys were very angry. So the keeper said they might have 4 in the morning and 3 at night. With which arrangement they were all well pleased. The actual number of the chestnuts, 7, remained the same, but there was an adaptation to the likes and dislikes of those concerned." Here's the idea. The same thing was going on. The monkeys were getting 7 chestnuts a day. But under one arrangement they approved, they liked it. Under the other they disapproved, they didn't like it at all. The idea is that our attitudes sometimes vary, even though what they're in response to doesn't vary at all. That's the general problem of the argument from variability. Our states of mind vary even when we're faced with the same circumstance in the world. I want to outline the logical structure, but before we do that, let's take a look at the general framework here. It really is that if we think about ourselves having certain states of mind, the thought is that 2 different people, or 2 different animals, or even the same person at different times or in different circumstances, in response to the same condition of the world, can have 2 very different states of mind. So my mental states can vary even though the state of the world doesn't vary at all. Now here's what's disturbing. I've got 2 different reactions, in the case of the monkeys, or 2 different representations, whether those representations are perceptions or beliefs of the way the world is. And they might vary even though there's no variation in the world. They vary, moreover, in a way that suggests a disagreement. For example, the approval or disapproval of the monkeys, or maybe a perception that that thing is light and another perception that it's dark, or that it's hot, or that it's cold, or that it's large, or that it's small. Those kinds of variations can be taking place, and there really is a clash there. Is it large or small? Can't be both. Is it hot or cold? Can't be both. But the world remains the same. So if we want to spell this out in terms of the logical structure rather than the, you might say, pictorial structure, we could think of it this way. Our first premise is a premise concerning variability. And we might just put it this way. Different beings, because after all, sometimes these will be people, sometimes they'll be the same person, sometimes it will be different animals. Different beings perceive the world differently. In other words, if we're thinking especially about beliefs, but we could generalize this to perception, we could just say there are disagreements. People disagree about the world, even though they're presented with the same circumstance in the world, even though they're presented with the same evidence about that. And the same thing could be true of different beings perceiving the world. It's the same world they're perceiving, but their perceptions may differ and they may clash. The second premise is going to turn out to be crucial because the mere fact that people disagree, respond differently to the world, different times, for example, or that different people have different perceptions, different animals have different perceptions, none of that really tells us anything directly, even if they clash. Maybe one's right, the others are wrong. The second premise is crucial because it says there's no way to decide. There's no neutral way to tell who's right. So we can think of it as a premise of undecidability. It simply says there is no neutral way to decide among them, among those different perceptions, among those different beliefs. There is no way to tell who's perceiving the world accurately and who's not. So here we have some state of mind. Let's say S1. Here we have a state of mind, S2. The world is what it is. We assume that S1 and S2 clash. They really do disagree. They perceive things differently, and in a way that the world can't satisfy both at the same time. And so, I mean, after all, if I see one side of the coin and say, oh, it's heads, and you see the other side of the coin and say it's tails, we could both be right. But sometimes we perceive things in a way that we couldn't both be right. And so the thought is, look, what do we do? How would we decide who's right, if anybody? Maybe they're both wrong. Well, yeah, there's no neutral way. This person is going to say, I'm right, S1 is the way the world is. This will say S2 is the way the world is. A third person can't be a neutral observer. They might side with this person, but then they're on that side. They might side with this person. We already had somebody who did that. Maybe they have yet a different view. Well, then that just adds to the problem. And so the conclusion is, now the one that really is the skeptical conclusion. It's a skepticism. Notice, if different beings perceive the world differently, in a way that clashes, they can't all be right, there's no neutral way to decide among them. In other words, which one is reasonably taken to represent the world. There's no way to have a reasonable belief about the world. And so there is no reasonable belief about the world. I have no reason to think that this perception, S1, reflects the world accurately, since after all, this person has a representation, S2, that represents it in a different and conflicting way. I have no neutral way to decide between them. So I have no reason to think it's like S1. I have no reason to think it's like S2. I have no reason to think it's some other way, or somewhere halfway in between, or that in some sense both are right, or anything. I have no reason to choose among them or to decide some other option. So in short, I can't tell. Now, this was, I think, the most popular skeptical argument in ancient times. It comprises fully 5 out of Sextus Empiricus's 10 modes in arguing for skepticism. The first argument, or trope as he puts it, shows that the same impressions are not produced by the same objects, owing to the differences in animals. So sometimes it's a question of different animals. We perceive the world in a way that's different from the way a cat or a dog perceives it. They perceive it in a way that's radically different from the way that a bug or a bat perceives it. Fish perceive things differently. Some fish have a magnetic sense that we lack, for example. Bats have sonar, we don't have that. There are very different perceptions of the world. Now, some of those don't clash. The fish, for example, is simply detecting a feature of the world that we don't detect. That's not to say there's any clash. It's like seeing different sides of the coin. But many animals do see things in ways that are radically different. We see things as dark that a cat or a dog, having better night vision, can actually see as light. And the same thing is going to be true with lots of other things. Something will feel light to us that would crush a bug. So there are many differences in perceptions among different species of animals. That's the first source of differences in animals. Philo says, for example, that differences that exist in animals are not one particular only, but are unspeakable in point of number. As usual, Zhuangzi gives us the best examples. Eels consort with fishes, while men admire Mao Chang and Li Ji, at the sight of whom fishes plunge deep down into the water, birds soar high in the air, and deer hurry away. Who will say what's the correct standard of beauty? The same thing applies to virtue. Zhuangzi says, in my opinion, the standard of human virtue and of positive and negative is so obscured, it's impossible to actually know it as such. People live in different ways, they have different conceptions of virtue. What's the right way to live, absolutely speaking? There's no way to tell. There's no neutral way to decide among those competing schemes of values. So there's no reasonable belief to have about how to live in the world. The second mode that Sextus talks about is based on the differences in people. That's what the argument from disagreement usually focuses on, thinking of these states as beliefs, thinking of these as two different people in response to the same world and even the same evidence about the world, nevertheless might form very different beliefs. there's no neutral way to decide among them. After all, they have the same evidence. And so you might say there's no reasonable belief to have about the world. Who's right? No reasonable way to tell, says the skeptic. And so, in that position, we end up saying, well, yes, we should really suspend judgment about who's right and who's wrong, about the very facts about the world. Different people respond to things differently. The other modes that are variations on the argument from variability in Sextus talk about the same person at different times, or in different locations in relation to the object, or in different circumstances. I may perceive things one way when I'm in a certain mood, and differently at another time when I'm in a different mood. I might see things close up that I wouldn't have perceived at all, or that I would have perceived very differently when I'm farther away. And the same thing can be true in different circumstances. Things look different in different lighting, for example. A certain noise might sound loud in one context where the rest of your surroundings are silent, but actually sound like a normal sort of sound if there's more noise going on in the background. And so all of those things too can matter. In other words, it doesn't have to be two different people or two different animals here. It can simply be me at one time, me at another time. Me in one circumstance, me in another circumstance. Me in one mood, me in another mood. And so all of those things, and we can reflect that. Here's happy me, here's sad me. And we might perceive things very differently, even though the state of the world hasn't changed. It's just my own mood, my own circumstances, the time, the conditions under which I am perceiving things, and so forth. So we get the same thing. Look, if even I perceive the world differently at different times, in different moods, and so on, then I'm in a sense disagreeing with myself. And there's no neutral way to decide whether the happy me or the sad me is getting things right. So there's no reasonable belief to have about the world. Now, how good an argument is this? I think it is a very powerful argument. There are various kinds of responses one might have to it, but it's not at all easy to say what we should do. One thing we could say is that this is not true, or at least that on some things beings perceive the world in the same sorts of ways. We try to find common elements. Yes, it's true that I might see things differently in different lighting, when I'm far away, when I'm close up, when I'm happy, when I'm sad, etc., etc., etc. But on the other hand, presumably, I always see things in a certain way. I always perceive physical objects as being in space and time, for example. I never get into a mood where I just see things floating around as if they're not attached to space and time at all. And the same thing might be true of other animals. So one thing we can do to challenge this is try to find common elements, aspects in which variations do not occur within myself, between individual people, between various species of animals. A second response is to look at that second premise and say, undecidability. Maybe there are neutral ways of deciding among these different perceptions, at least sometimes. After all, here's a case in my own background. My wife and I were looking for apartments in Pittsburgh years ago when we were first married. And we looked at an apartment. We were discussing it later. It was in a very nice building, but the apartment itself was in terrible disrepair. In any case, we were talking about it, and I remembered the building as being brown brick. She remembered it as being yellow brick. And so our perceptions of this were different. She said it was yellow. I said it was brown. And we argued about this over lunch. And it bothered me so much that I ended up driving back to that apartment building just to see what it was really like. Was she right? Was it yellow brick? Was I right that it was brown brick? Maybe you can guess the result. It was alternating columns of yellow and brown brick. So as we approached the entrance, she was on one side and saw the yellow. I was on the other side and saw the brown. Well, sometimes that happens, but notice there was a neutral way. We could go back and look at the building again and get another impression. If somebody says, hey, I saw that person had long hair, and someone else says, no, I think it was short hair. Well, let's say somebody had a video of the event. We can look at that. Oh, you were right, it was long. I guess, I don't know, I didn't see that. And so sometimes there really is a neutral way to tell. And so we might argue that undecidability, even if it's true sometimes, isn't always true. Finally, is it true that it follows that if all this is the case, there's no reasonable belief about the world? Maybe, after all, if there are different perceptions, they really do clash. The world can be at most one of those ways. I have no way to decide, what should I think about the world? Now, the skeptic says there is no right attitude to have. And in fact, I should suspend judgment. I should give up my beliefs and realize that I have no reasonable basis for believing it to be one way rather than another. There is a view popular, well, among some quarters in contemporary philosophy that is known as permissivism. And it says, well, maybe if I have my view supported by my perceptions of the world, by the evidence I have, then actually it is reasonable to believe it. Maybe it can be reasonable for me to believe that the world is like this, and reasonable for you to believe that it's like this. We disagree, we can't both be right, but that doesn't make one or the other of us unreasonable. It might mean we both have reasons. We have good reasons to believe that the world is the way we think it is. Can't both be right, but that can nevertheless be a reasonable thing to adopt. And so we could adopt a permissivist attitude and say, well, the fact that I can't have a neutral way to support my own beliefs as against yours doesn't mean it's not reasonable for me to hold them. Maybe it is. And so the permissivist is going to deny the inference from these two premises to that conclusion.